So here's what I want to talk about. Four things that are really relevant to, I think, the people who procure and manage transportation the most. First, I'm going to talk about how it's procured today, make sure we're level set. And then talk about the dominant design, because I think that's a key concept that a lot of people don't know about that is very relevant for us today. I'll talk about how transportation procurement is being disrupted and some of those things, and I'd love to make that more of the discussion. And then at the very end, everyone can tell me why I'm wrong. And you can disagree with me, have a debate. We'll finish up the half an hour with that. All right, so let's talk about from the beginning what it is that we're doing for transportation procurement. So who procures transportation? Make sure, I think I'm talking to this front row here. Okay, you guys who actually buy it. Tell me if this sounds like you. You typically, and this is what my experience is, you run a reverse auction or bid for the entire network using average weekly volumes. You take the annual, divide by 52, because that's good enough. You invite incumbent carriers you've used before, maybe for new lanes, and you invite some new ones too to bring them in the mix. They submit contract rates to you for a year or longer. I know I've worked with some companies that do 2-year contracts, some evergreen contracts. It's a wide mix of things. And they submit that for each lane. You might have 1 to 5,000. I've seen 20,000 lane bids. The primaries are selected mainly on price through some tool, hopefully using some kind of optimization-based procurement, but it picks the lowest price subject to some constraints and maybe some trade-offs, and those are fed directly into a routing guide and a TMS. And what's typically, if something was won as a tour, it's broken into pieces and each lane is put in separately, and these are given with a soft commitment, which means if they don't always show up, it's okay as long as your acceptance ratio is above a certain thing. If your volume doesn't materialize all the time, that's okay as long as it doesn't go below something, kind of a soft agreement. Alternates are the people who didn't win. They're fed in as secondaries to the TMS, and they have no volume commitments, but they show up in the routing guide. And then during operations, tendering is made first to the primary, and if they reject, then to the secondaries, and then eventually maybe as a last resort to the spot market or to a broker. And then finally, contract rates are paid throughout the year at the same rate, regardless of the change in market conditions, with only fuel surcharge rates fluctuating. Does this sound familiar? Right? And so is this a smart system? This was actually, you can't really answer that until you know when it came about. So why was this system put in place? Who was buying or managing transportation in 1980 or earlier? That counts for all. Who was not alive in 1980? There we go. There we go. This talk gets weirder and weirder as I give it. Something very important happened in 1980. Prior to 1980, when you went to procure transportation, it was a very regulated market. It made air look silly. You couldn't negotiate rates. Carriers were allowed to have contracts with 8 shippers. That's it. It's called the rule of 8. There were geographic monopolies. You had to, if you're a carrier, you wanted to enter a market, you had to petition the government, the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, and say a rate, and you had to prove that it was beneficial, as opposed to going in there and see what the market said. The net result of this was there was very little liquidity. That's a good word here at Uber. There was very little liquidity in each lane. There were geographic monopolies. In 1980, President Carter enacted the Motor Carrier Act as amongst many of deregulation acts, Staggers Act and some other ones, and deregulated the industry. It was tremendous. No one knew what would happen, but 3 big things happened. The number of truckload carriers increased by a factor of 10x in the market, where there's now about 150,000 if you count the owner-operators from a much, much lower base. Because of that, the rate for truckload trucking dropped in half within 8 years for a shipper. It did something that most people don't think about. Prior to 1980, there was no LTL and truckload market. It was a market. And if you owned a geographic monopoly, you would do whatever it takes. So this bifurcated the market until now we have LTL and truckload, and they are very different. Usually you don't procure them together. But it did something else, and that is it changed the way you procured. So if there's suddenly all these people, a perfectly competitive market, what do you assume that there is for a lane? A market price. And so how do you find a market price? You run an auction. So this system, which we all like to make fun of, was the most revolutionary thing coming along since flying cars in transportation, because it allowed a company to figure out what a market rate is, where beforehand everything was very regulatory driven. So it was a very innovative thing, and now we look at it and we laugh and say, well, this is so antiquated. At the time, This was very cutting edge. In fact, my dissertation was all about doing the fourth bullet points, applying combinatorial optimization in transportation auctions, and it was an awesome dissertation. So if you ever want to read it, just let me know, but it breaks my heart now that it's antiquated. So let me do a little side discussion about what's known as a dominant design, because what we have here is a dominant design. 90% of all truckload transportation is procured using this dominant design from the 90s. So what's a dominant design? Who's ever heard of a dominant design before? Anyone? Okay, good, Bill, good. So a dominant design, it's a cool concept, and as soon as we talk about it, you'll start seeing it everywhere. So it's something where mainly applied to products. When you have a new product coming out, there's a lot of innovation, and they all look different. But then eventually one design characteristics become dominant. It gains the allegiance of the marketplace. It embodies the requirements of many classes of users, and it's what's known as a satisficer of many. It doesn't satisfy y'all, it's good enough, but it's not a great thing for any single user. So what the idea is that this thing comes out, and there's different phases for when a new product comes out. The first is this fluid phase where there's all this innovation, and people come with different forms, and I'll give you some examples in a second. The second phase is a general form is picked up, and now people try to make it faster, better, cheaper. So the form is set, but you get into this transitional phase where you're all about the process of making the product or delivering the service. And then the last phase is what's known as specific phase or complacency. That's where the dominant design is. And so we, right now, are in the dominant design of transportation procurement, which is what I just described. This very formal process that was innovative back when I had hair, but not so innovative now. All right, so what is a dominant design? Let me give you some examples. Cell phone is a great example. Who had a cell phone? When's the earliest cell phone that someone had? Did anyone have one in the 80s? A mobile phone. You had one, carried in a box, a Motorola. Awesome. Anyone have one? My first one was in 96, 97, and it was a block. My wife had a flip phone, and I was very jealous, right? Think about all the different phones. Any Crackberry people, right? Do you still cry that you don't have it? Yeah. You've been dominated, and your design has been dominated. You're no longer totally satisfied. I bet you don't have one now. I'm going on a limb. I bet everyone's smartphone, and I bet you all have at least one, looks like this. It might not be an iPhone. It might be something similar, but I bet it has a touch screen. I bet you can't remove its batteries. I bet it's rechargeable. This is a dominant design, right? And so it's come to this, and is it the best one? I don't know, but it's dominant. Let me give you another example. Bicycles, very innovative in the 1830s, right? When they came out, all these different types and sets and sights, but now almost every bike looks the same. 2 wheels, the same size, a chain in the middle that goes to the back tire, steering at the front. Very common, dominant design. Last one, typewriters, or keyboards really. First came out to make it easier to use the teletype, to make it easier for transmission. And all these different ones came out. The 1871 is known as Hanson's Ball. Have you ever seen this before? This is where Mark Twain lost all of his money. He invested in that. First QWERTY keyboard came out in 1873. And then you go to 1920, 1960, 1975. Looks about the same, doesn't it? We have the same keyboard. Is it the best? No. It's dominant. Does that make sense? You have this dominant design. And so why are dominant designs bad? Because they have this complacency and they're ripe for disruption. They're just ripe to be disrupted. And so a lot of times, and a lot of companies have fallen prey to this, they've made a better and better tool in that dominant design without thinking about things that have changed. So let's think back to what we did for transportation procurement. And so the whole idea here, the reason why we have this process today was to find the market rate. Because suddenly, after deregulation, right, suddenly there's a market. Before that, it was regulated. So with a market, you got to do search. The best way to search is an auction. And so that's the way it was. But what's the problem? There really is no market price. That's the key finding. And so I'm going to show you some things that most shippers don't see. When you guys look at a lane, and this is a real lane from some work that I do with Chainalytics, and this is one lane, 450 miles, so it's kind of a one-day trip. This is from 10 different shippers are on this, 3,000 loads per year, a little more than that. The average rate, or the median rate rather, is $2.93. Over this time period, it's 1 year, 2012 to 2013, so back in the good old days, right? Before capacity got real tight. But if you look at this, you might say, wow, I see the market rate. The market rate's about $2.93 a mile. And then we see some fluctuation, and we look at this as a shipper. You look at the fluctuation, what do you say? Well, people screwed up. It was a Friday, they had too many loads, they did stupid things, so you see all this volatility. So you might say, well, this is a pretty volatile market. It goes all the way from about 287, or actually down to 280, up to 305 on average. This is the average rate paid per day. But if you dive a little deeper, and this is what most shippers don't see, is this. This is the exact same chart, except it's not an average per day, it's each load. So when you look at this, let me go back. Can I go back? Yes. Look at it, very volatile, right? I could do a coefficient of variation for you statistics people or people who've taken SC0X in my online courses. You can see it's very volatile. But when you look at this, you say, well, there's some weird stuff going on, because some of this isn't so volatile. And it's even more interesting when you color code it by company. So these are actual data of companies' rates. So let me ask you, what's the market rate? Right? The number one answer in any grad school program when someone asks you that is you say, it depends, right? It depends on what you're doing. Because let's look at some of these. And again, this is real data. I didn't make it up. So you got the green, the aqua green one, they're paying about $3.40 a mile. And then you got the orange one paying about $2.25. So almost $1 a mile different. Are the aquamarine people just stupid? What's going on? We don't know. We just look at this data, and the issue is you don't really know what's happening. You don't know if this is steady freight or if all the orange stuff is just happening, at 9 o'clock at night. There's other ones. Look at the black one, and it has a drop. We know what happened there. They did a bid, and the rates went down. This is before the capacity crisis. Obviously, now it would be going up. You can see different ones. The blue one where it went from 2 to 1. So you have all these different things going on, and then you have this visibility that Uber has, that we have as Chainalytics, and other people do is they look at a collection of companies coming in that you as a shipper don't see. And that's why a lot of times shippers say, well, auction's the best way. I want to find out the best rates. You're looking for a market price when a market price doesn't exist. And so what's happening now is companies, thank God to the hurricanes and crises in 2017, because it's finally making people wake up and find a new way to do procurement. We're starting to focus more on disrupting that dominant design. And that dominant design wasn't stupid. It was fit to remedy a previous situation. Okay, so how is it being disrupted? This is where I'm going to start getting into the discussion portion of it, and I'd love to get your guys' feedback. Every shipper I talk to, and we work with about 50 companies up at MIT, and it's funny, we do projects every year with our master's students and with companies, and if you look back over the last 15 years, I actually made a word cloud. Does everyone know what a word cloud is? Right, with the words and they pop up, of all the thesis descriptions from 2004 going forward. And in 2004, it was this big bubble, and the big word was RFID. That was the big thing, because it was going to take over the world. Then came 3D printing, right? Then last year was blockchain. Everything was blockchain. This year, it's transportation. And it's all because of what happened in the last 18 months. So more and more of our shippers are coming in and saying, hey, we got to get on the bottom of this transportation stuff. The rates are just ridiculous. We don't understand it anymore. The process is broken. And it's not that it's broken, it's just that the situation has changed. So more shippers are exploring different ways to interact. And this requires some abilities. I'm just going to put these out there. First, it requires the recognition that there is no one set solution. Because the beautiful thing about an auction was you could do it for everything. It was one and done, right? It was a one-size-fits-all. It's binary. It's either contract, and if it fails the contract, go spot, right? And so what we now have to do is we say, you know what? There are different types of freight out there. There's steady freight. There's random freight. There's freight that's not regular, but it's consistent. So there's different ways of looking and characterizing what the freight is, and it requires a shipper to recognize that and to start segmenting their network. Because every lane isn't the same. And a lot of times people treat the same. They take that big hammer of an auction and treat it for all the same. We're starting to break that up a little bit. And we have to be able to handle multiple forms of contracts or relationships. Typically, what we have in trucking is the weirdest contract ever. And it seems normal to us who've been in truckload trucking. Talk to anyone else in procurement and explain what a truckload contract means. It doesn't guarantee volume. We might not show up. They might not show up. But that's okay. It's just the only thing that's guaranteed, the price, if it happens to happen when we say it's going to happen. It's a weird thing, but we're used to it. Now we're seeing more forms of relationships, of contracts coming up. The one-time transactional spot is out there. What about guaranteed freight, guaranteed volume? Actually, Roger Willett Sears in the 90s did very innovative tier pricing that kind of fell by the wayside because they found carriers couldn't differentiate and their systems couldn't handle it. We're finding more interest now, and I'm doing a project with a large CPG manufacturer looking at index-based pricing. Does anyone use index-based pricing for their truckload? We should talk. We should talk, because they're trying to figure out what index to go to and how do I set that up. So there's all these different ways you can segment your freight transportation network, and it doesn't mean you have the same contract for each. You can have different forms of contracts. And the whole trick then is to match, right? That we talk about matching the carrier and that shipper-carrier relationship with the freight type, and then being able to manage this portfolio. Because I used to give this talk a lot about the funny thing about auctions. You can go in the literature, the technical literature, and there's reams of paper. So many people have made tenure by creating better transportation auction techniques that will never, ever, ever be used in practice because they don't solve the real problem. There was always a gap between what you could do for a strategic plan and people going with a surgeon's knife and can come up with something and what you can actually implement in the TMS. So TMSs right now, in my opinion, are the gating factor for what you can do for what's innovative. Because right now it's pretty much the waterfall routing guide method. Some things are coming in, but it's a hard thing to get managed. The other thing is the contract, getting the legal contract in. Because what shippers are trying to do is get some guarantee of coverage, and the carrier's trying to get a guarantee, right, of volume being there. And so in that middle ground and moving into new innovative relationships is not easy. So I'm seeing a lot of movement here, and we're doing a lot of projects trying to understand how shippers and carriers can better work together. But what we're moving away from is creating a better hammer in auctions. And so we're trying to find more innovative ways to interact between shippers and carriers. All right, and so that's my prepared part of the talk. We talked about how it's being procured today for the most part, and I think everyone's done that. Auctions are still dominant. Then we talked about the dominant design methodology and the whole idea of a dominant design. It's not the best, but it's good enough for most. And so the whole idea, when you have a dominant design, you get a complacency period, and then you're ripe for disruption. Think of every industry that's gone away. Blockbuster could have bought Netflix, right? All those, it was so many examples out there. That's a dangerous place to be. And we had a wake-up call last fall that maybe this isn't the right way to do it. And so now, I'd like to open it up. These are my two dogs, and if you've taken any of my classes, you see them in every lecture. They are my dominant design. So what questions do you guys have for me? What disagreements do you have? Because I love when people disagree with me. I was at a RELA conference once a couple years ago, and someone shouted from the screen as I was talking about how carriers were not covering the full risk of fuel price risk. He shouted, "You're a liar!" from the audience. It was awesome. So I welcome any interactions. Yes, sir. What company are you from? Starbucks. I've heard of them. Yeah. Fair. And so that's something I should probably make more explicit. I'm not going to go back. Yeah, so the question, or the point was that I was missing the supplier management. I would make a bet that everyone has tier 1, 2, 3 carriers. Has anyone not segmented for that? Now, what you do with them might differ. I know when I did work with one large home improvement company, they had the idea that their large carrier, their tier 1s, they got the big primary great lanes, but for getting that, they also had to carry the red zone lanes, the ones that no one wanted to carry. And so everyone treats their tier 1, tier 2, tier 3s a little differently. It's a valid point. So you have to treat the supplier a little differently because you want them to be doing different things. I know I used to go out and help carriers run bids, but before you run a bid, what we did for Walmart was we created a tool that helps them to determine what they should not put out to bid. What should go to their private fleet? Because they have a huge resource there that they're expanding. And so the whole idea when we did this first tool, and this was about 8 years ago now, they call it the MIT tool. I can't call it the MIT tool because every tool is an MIT tool to me. We call it the Freight Network Optimization Tool. It went and identified where it made sense for their dedicated fleet to go and where they should domicile. What we found is they used this and they found that the actual fleet grew, which was not expected, but it shrunk in the long haul. It went to more to the smaller hauls and it made sense. So having a tool like that, you treat them with a different class of carrier, and so you help segment your network a little better. Any other questions, disagreements? Yes, sir. Yeah, so the question is, if I can restate it, is there's been a general trend in business to move to the service model versus a product model, where consumers value access instead of ownership, the servicization of things. Absolutely, it's happening. I would say that transportation has been there for the last 20 or so years. I think the percent of the fleet that is private fleet has been shrinking and flipping to dedicated at most, but it's an amazing thing how that's happening, and Uber is helping move that. Zipcars is moving that, and the biggest example is Spotify. I used to have hundreds of albums. When I was talking with Russ last night, I had hundreds and hundreds of albums, CDs. I had 8 tracks, right? And now I haven't bought an album or a CD. I haven't bought music in probably 5 years since I have Spotify. It's dramatically changing manufacturers' approach. Every car, I read recently, every car introduced to a shared service like Zipcar or Car2Go takes 7 to 10 cars out of the market. Right? That's big news if you're a manufacturer. For transportation, I don't know. I think it's already outsourced. I think the amount, who has a private fleet? Anyone private fleets? Is it mainly local or is it long haul? Local, yeah. I think we're seeing a lot more rationalization. I started getting into this market in the early 90s, and that when the big thing was when truckers hated railroads, remember those days? And they wouldn't do anything and everyone tried to get everything. And so I ran a bid for a large retailer in 1997, and they had all of their imports at that time coming into one port of LA, and they assigned it to one carrier. Oh, what's wrong with that? It made a ton of sense. They saved a ton of money until a strike happened. But anyway, that's another story. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so the point is, and correct me if I misstate, is that your view is that Uber Rides is more of a B2C. And it's a company going to individual consumers, and that when we talk trucking, there's no C here, right? This is all B2B, and no one has a truckload of stuff delivered to their house, I hope. So the question is, what's the difference, what's the same? I actually used to give a talk, because remember about 2 years ago, everyone was going to be the Uber of X, and everything was this, and I'd saying Uber for trucking, that doesn't make sense, because I had a very limited view of what it meant. If you think of it in terms of higher utilization of the asset, that's what this is doing. That's what I see UberFreight doing and that Uber Rides did. Uber Rides took a resource that was underutilized, right? We operate our cars, 10% of the time? Maybe 15% of the time if you have a bad commute, and made it so those would be utilized more. UberFreight is trying to get those mainly the small owner-operators, get them have higher utilization as well. So to me, that's having the same effect. It's increasing the utilization of an underused resource. And the challenge is, we always say there's not enough truck drivers. I don't quite agree with that. There's usually not enough truck drivers where we want them, at the time we want them, at the price we want to pay. And so I think Uber's Freight is starting to solve that, and they're not paying me to say that. But I think that's the approach that they're going more to the driver and trying to better utilize that underlying asset, the driver and the tractor and the trailer at points. Right, so the point was, for Constellation Brands, have you started releasing the cannabis brew yet? Not yet. Well, look, we'll keep our ears open. So the point was that you want not just to get capacity, but capacity at the right price. You want a price lower than your competitors, is what I heard. Okay, but that's true, but here's the thing. So you can make a blue sky plan, and when I used to run these bids, mainly in the 90s and early 2000s, I would save every company 7 to 10% every year. I'd run a new auction, I save you 7 to 10%. I wasn't really saving you 7 to 10%. I was comparing an optimal solution out of my model to what they did last year with all the failures. So the whole idea, if you have a hard, rigid contract rate, that's awesome. Nothing will beat that until reality hits, and when you have failure rates. And so what we're looking at is, let's say this is your contract rate, this is the crazy spot rate, right? But what if you pay an index? Does that mute it? Because sometimes the relationship you have with a carrier and they have with you matters for something. And so we're doing a project up at MIT looking at trust. Trust. If you're a shipper, will you stay with that carrier during a soft market when other people are coming in lower? And will you expect them to stay with you when it's a tight market and other people will be paying them more? And if you have a longer term agreement, there is more trust there. So the question is, what do you want the ultimate total cost delivered be versus the planning cost? Because you're right, you run an auction, that's the low cost to the plan, but the plan rarely happens. But we can talk more about it. It's very, very valid points. Yes, sir.
What's meaningful for for shippers are like, how frequent should we run the bids, right? How frequent how would that benefit the shipper or the carrier?
By running them more frequently?
Yes.
No, I'm saying that, so frequency is something that's really interesting. So we did a project for Walmart where we divided, they do 2-year auctions, right? But they divide the network in half. Not just east of the Mississippi, west of the Mississippi. They divided so that they overlapped, and they did half 1 year, and then 2 years later they did the other half, because that gave them the option, if something was going bad, they would throw it into that year's bid. So I think the whole idea is not to necessarily set contract rates for everything. Contract rates make a ton of sense for certain things, right? For steady state volume, it just makes a ton of sense. P&G's been doing something called synchromodality in Europe, and they're starting to introduce it here, where you identify those flows that go from manufacturing plant through their mixing centers down to a customer DC, identifying single SKU, multi-pallet loads that can be consistently moved, and trying to, because if I can move something from plant in the truck through the mixing center where it never really stops and on, I save a great deal of money. And so those are things you want to contract. So I think the frequency, I think the annual's not going to go away, but I don't think annual for everything. I know I just read something that the Caplice CEO was talking about mini bids, surgical design. Yeah, I think we're going to see some of those for adjustments, but you run the risk of doing Band-Aids all the time. I think it's not a single one-take-all, and the answer isn't run a bid every month or once a year. I think you have to segment your network and determine what procurement method you use and what relationship you use, what contract you use for that. So my net is it's getting more complicated, which is interesting. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for more innovation in this space, and rather than just doing an annual bid or just going 100% to spot. Last question. Is that okay? So the question is, how are TMSs going to keep up with this complexity? That's a good question because there are fewer providers out there. But they've been leading it. There's a lot of functionality. I built functionality in a TMS in 1998 that handled tiered waterfall rates going out to different spot markets. Remember the last time we had big innovations in truckload transportation was '99, when freight boards were going to revolutionize the process? That was one of those dominant design things that never really came to fruition. They all went away, except truckstop.com, and they renamed themselves. So I think, I forgot the question now. TMS, a lot of them are already ahead, you just don't use the functionality. A lot of TMSs are there, and if you try to do it with a low-cost TMS, it could be a problem. All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it.